The concept of Ummah in South Africa, among South African Muslims, has a genesis of about 350 years. 5 years after the Dutch colonialists arrived in South Africa, the first Muslim arrived. That was a Muslim either exiled from the liberation struggles in Indonesia or as slaves to service the economic interests of the Dutch. And so Ummah was formed fairly negatively. First, it's people who've been banished from their homelands. And then it became far more positive as other slaves joined, and Ummah then transformed into an assimilation of all slaves who had identified the Dutch colonialists and the enslavers with Christianity and therefore turned to Islam, which was then the religion of the slaves. And so Islam and Malay culture and identity assimilated them. So you had then the second wave of other slaves joining the original Malay Muslims as a community. And as this Ummah developed, Islam was then banned for almost 150 years. You could not practice it. And so that gave a depth to the very definition of Ummah, in the sense that here was a community deeply religious but not allowed to worship. And so Ummah was a creative community. It became an increasingly musical community because it tried to sing away what it could not do as formal worship. And then, of course, under apartheid, when all blacks were discriminated against, that then gave this small Muslim community, this Ummah, a insertion into a larger oppressed community of blacks. And we had enough leaders to lead us into that path. And so Ummah was distinct within a community of blacks, but with a common set of values and a common purpose of overthrowing apartheid, even if there were a few different things that the Ummah may have wanted post-apartheid. Then, of course, when Nelson Mandela was freed in 1990, the Ummah came together for a 3-day conference to decide what was their vision for a future South Africa. And very consciously, this Muslim community chose a future that was democratic, a future that was based on human rights because of the denial of rights in the past, a future that was based on freedom because of the enslavement of the past, a future that was based on secularism because of the Christian nationalism that fired apartheid and gave it its life. And so that was the Ummah that then adopted a fairly progressive agenda and a fairly progressive view of themselves into the future. And so I think that these are the mutations that the very notion of Ummah went into, and I think probably the reason that the South African component of the global Muslim community is probably one of the happier ones in the world today. Character forms, in some senses, out of a forward-looking vision of yourself, how you envisage yourself into the future. And that shapes your sense of ideals and objective. In South Africa, however, I think that much of the South African Muslim character was formed out of adversity, out of denial, that you became better Muslims because Islam was banned. You became more hungry for freedom because you were enslaved. You became more set on equality because you were deemed unequal in the apartheid hierarchy. And so in a very clear sense, all the attributes that God would have, the divine attributes of justice, of equality, of freedom, and so forth, were, in a sense, transposed onto the Muslim community out of a sense of the denial of those attributes. And so I think that to a large extent, the softness, if I can put it like that, and the kind of easy reach for anger amongst the Muslims today, globally, is largely because of an excess of comfort from our ruling elites and an absence of social solidarity with people who are oppressed, because adversity makes us angry and not makes us inclusive and striving for something different. And so to a large extent, the colonial slavery and apartheid experience had been centrally involved in the formation of a Muslim character. More importantly, the period of the banning of Islam took us as Muslims away from not the primary sources, but the secondary sources of our religion. We had the Quran in the memory of people, which was then written down word for word. We had the example of the Prophet in the memory of our people, but we did not easily have access to the scholarship that followed it. And in a fascinating way, it freed us up from the second-hand imitation of sources. It forced us to go to the Quran and the Sunnah to find political answers for the dilemmas we faced. Had we had the scholarship of Ibn Taymiyyah, we may have moved, for example, into conservatism. Had we had, for example, the scholarship of the Ikhwan, in the early days, we would have moved maybe to Islamism. What we did was we went to the Quran and the character of the Prophet and drew our examples from there and then made ijtihad. We then reasoned our way out of the dilemmas we were in, out of the deprivation we were in, out of the oppression we were in, to envisage a world that would be Muslim and Islamic. And so I think that character formation is, in our case, was largely due of deprivation, but also dislocation from secondary sources of interpretation of our faith. There was an amazing discovery that we made that turned all our usual formulations of character on its head. For example, I saw more commonality in the Christianity of Desmond Tutu than I saw in the ulama of, say, the North, who were Muslim leaders, pious and highly learned, but who were excusing apartheid or silent in the face of apartheid. I could identify more with the Desmond Tutu and Alan Busak. In fact, I could identify more with Joe Slovo as the Secretary General of the Communist Party and other communists who went to jail for my freedom than the ulama who were silently making as if there was no problem from their mimbars and their mihrabs in the mosques of South Africa. And so we learned a valuable lesson about character. Character is universal, it's human. It is not the monopoly of any religion. That we found far more in common transversally. Progressive, good Muslims, Hindus, Christians, Jews, communists, atheists, than we sometimes found vertically between Muslims or between Christians, because you had Christians apologizing for apartheid and Christians opposing apartheid. We had Muslims apologizing for apartheid and Muslims opposing apartheid. And we had far more in common with a transversal band. And so the notion of character as being a religious commodity is false. In South Africa, we understood the distinction between populism and popular. We often found that when a liberation movement is popular, it has a set of core values and a set of core ideas that resonate with people, and people move towards those ideas, adopt it, embrace it, and then eventually are willing to die for it. Populist is when a leader or a movement listens to the instincts of people and then echo it back to them in order to get their support without moving them in character formation at all. And so, for example, what we need to understand, especially for the world today, is that we need to denounce populism in order to let the popular, what is good and wholesome and healthy in terms of both values and interest, to let that resonate amongst people and to attract people towards good ideas.